Hey guys, it's Cece, and today I am here to do my December wrap-up and my January TBR. So, I comboed these videos last month, I liked the result, I liked the whole format, so I'm trying it again this month. I'm not saying this is going to be a permanent thing, but based on the number of books I can tell you that I'm going to be reading, I figured this was going to be like the tiniest TBR, and so it just made sense to put it together with this video, make it all one. I also have some books to talk about, all of the books that I read in the month of December. I completed a total of 7 books in the month of December, the last month of 2019, and my theme for December was, there were kind of 2 themes. Theme number 1 was finish books that I had already started, and theme number 2 was get to 2019 releases that I missed earlier in the year that I wanted to finish before the year concluded. So that's what I have to talk about. I have a bunch of books that fit into those 2 categories. I'm going to talk about these mostly in order from my least favorite to my most favorite, but before I talk about my least favorite, before I get into that ranking, there is one book I want to talk about that I didn't give a rating to, but I really liked it, so I didn't really know where to fit it in with all of these other books, so I'm going to talk about that first, and then we're going to go least favorite to most favorite. Make sense to everybody? Makes sense to me. I guess I'll just have to find out. So let's go ahead and jump in to the December wrap-up. So that first book that I wanted to talk about that I didn't give a official star rating to is a TwoSpirit Journey, the autobiography of a lesbian Ojibwa Cree elder by Ma-Nee Chacaby with Mary Louise Plummer. So, that's a lot of words. I started this book in November as part of Nonfiction November, as well as Indigathon, which was a readathon dedicated to reading Native authors. I didn't get the chance to finish it in November because, as I've discussed in some other videos, some stuff happened in my life at the end of November. So, I moved this to December, and I finished it like the day before the final day of the year. I got a lot of reading done in the final 2 days of 2019. So let me explain what this book is, and then let me explain to you why I didn't give it a star rating. This is, as it says in the title, an autobiography, by Ma-Nee, and it is about her life as a two-spirit lesbian. It starts in the year she was born. Well, First, it starts with her family history. So, Ma-Nee was born in 1950, and it starts with a bit of her grandmother's history and her mother's history. It's about her growing up in the environment she grew up in, which is surrounded by a lot of alcoholic family members, but also by the incredible influence of her grandmother. It's about Ma-Nee going through a lot of different really horrific things. I'm going to leave my Goodreads review linked down below. There's a full list of triggers. This is an incredibly triggering book. Please, please look into the trigger warnings before you jump into this. Ma-Nee has dealt with a variety of sexual assaults in her life. She spent a lot of time as an alcoholic. She's been, emotionally and physically abused. There's a lot here. And I really loved this book for how much we got to look at Ma-Nee's life, but the writing style is incredibly dry. It is mostly because Ma-Nee has lived so much that it would be impossible to write this in a more accessible style, because this would be like volumes and volumes worth of material. So a lot of the time, very early on, it comes across as dry, and I think what's important to remember, especially for white readers, reading a book that is not in a narrative format that we necessarily recognize, is that this is part of an oral tradition. This is a book of Ma-Nee telling her life to someone else. And so that's why I think it's really important to read the afterword in this book by Mary Louise Plummer. She is Ma-Nee's friend who took notes, who listened to stories for months and months at a time, and committed this in English. And there's a lot in that afterword about the value of maintaining the author's voice while also making it more accessible in English, since this was a story told by someone for whom English was not a first language. So I just felt weird writing this book because there's so much here, there's so much of Ma-Nee's life, but the narrative structure is very different from one I am accustomed to, and so it took me a very long time to read. I really enjoyed it, I really recommend it, but please go in knowing about those trigger warnings and knowing that it's going to be a very different read if you read a lot of memoirs and autobiographies. It's going to have a different vibe, and you have to recognize that and you have to accept that this is a different method of storytelling. It's part of the oral tradition. So, yeah, those are my long-winded feelings on A Two-Spirit Journey. I'm really, really, really glad that I finally got the chance to read it. So, yeah, now I'm going to move on. I'm going to start with my least favorite book and work up to my favorite book. We have 6 more books to talk about. Let's get going. My least favorite book that I read in December was The Couple Next Door by Shari Lapena, I think. This is an adult thriller. I have been reading more thrillers recently. It has been going poorly because thrillers are just not my traditional thing that I read, and I think that they just end up so batshit that I often have a hard time with them. This book is no exception. The Couple Next Door is about a young married couple, and they leave their 6-month-old daughter at home one night when they go next door to a, dinner party, and when they come home, their baby is gone. And she's been taken. And so this is the mystery. It follows both of the married couple. It follows each of them in a narrative voice, as well as a detective is also one of the narrators. This is one of those books that, you won't be bored at any point reading it. You get a lot thrown at you all the time. Whenever you're like, okay, now I know what this book is about, it kind of veers left. So for some readers, that might be good. For me, a lot of the times I find thrillers frustrating because I tend to think twists are very, not annoying, what is the word for this? Unbelievable. I roll my eyes a lot because it feels like twists in thrillers are always trying to top every other twist. Or it's a twist that's been done a lot before. And so most of the time, I really like a book until a twist, and then I'm like, oh, really? Is that what this book is? This book was that, but 80 different times. It just keeps swapping. So if you want to be highly entertained by a thriller, this is fun for that. I was never bored. Like I said, I read it in a couple of sittings because I did want to know what happened, but it was pretty poorly written. It wasn't super great reading style-wise, and ultimately, all of the twists added up to a story that I thought was kind of incoherent and not that good. Yeah, so I gave this 2 stars. I don't know, if that's a good takeaway. Maybe that review made sense to you. It's exciting, and it's kind of garbage, but that's okay, because that's what some books are for. And the rest of these I have to talk about are going to be way more positive reviews because I gave pretty much every single one of these 4 stars, and then I have a 4.5 star at the end. So next I have a graphic novel, Stargazing by Jen Wang. This is a middle grade graphic novel about 2 friends who are both Chinese American. There's Moon and Christine, and Moon is new to the area, and her and Christine start to become friends. Moon is always there for Christine. She's this very weird person who just kind of finds her way into Christine's life, makes her question things. And then something very serious happens to Moon, and it becomes a graphic novel about whether or not Christine can be there for Moon the way Moon has been there for Christine in the past. So this was adorable. I have read Jen Wang graphic novels before. I think the only one I've actually read is In Real Life, but Jen Wang is most known for The Prince and the Dressmaker, I would say. This has a really cute style. This is an ARC, so only the first few pages of my copy had color. The rest were black and white, but here's an example of that style. I thought it was really sweet. I thought it was a really sweet friendship story, and a bunch of the stuff that happens to Moon in this book is the real experience of Jen Wang. So it's also about the author kind of working through that very traumatic moment in early childhood and how that impacted her life. I kind of wish I'd known that when I was reading it instead of afterwards, because I felt like some stuff happened here that was kind of out of nowhere. But it made way more sense once you factored in that it was something that the author was kind of working through. So I enjoyed this. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. Next, I have a book that's kind of out of left field for me, and that's The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. This is a classic. It was written in the 1950s. 1950... Oh, my boarding pass is on there. Because I read this on a plane. This was originally published in 1959. 1959, but I love the Netflix show. Like, obsessed with the Netflix show. And in November, I started rewatching The Haunting of Hill House, and while I was doing that, this arrived in an Owl Crate box, and it felt like the perfect chance to jump into this book because I don't know, my brain was hyper-focused on The Haunting of Hill House and that story and that world, and it was a hyper-fixation. So I decided to jump into the book. This is very different from the Netflix show, in case you are unaware. This is about a doctor who is gathering people together to be at Hill House, which is a reportedly haunted house, and he is going to be there with a representative of the family that owns the house, as well as 2 assistants, so that they can kind of record the creepy happenings of Hill House. And this follows Eleanor, and she's the main character, she's the narrator, and she is one of the assistants who comes to help the doctor. This was such a fascinating book, and I think it's interesting because I have an issue with some books, classics, let's say, being scary. I don't find classics scary because we had different standards for what was scary a few decades ago. We've had different definitions of what scary is, like, constantly over time. It's changed with time. But I did have faith in Shirley Jackson. I read her short story, The Lottery, when I was in high school, and it's one of those short stories that's, like, haunted me my entire life. You know, that short story that you read in English class where you're like, ooh, this is gonna stick with me and shape me in ways I don't know that I'm ready for. That was The Lottery by Shirley Jackson. And I have to say this was actually pretty spooky in some parts. Like, maybe it was being impacted by my love of the show, by my recent rewatch, and so a lot of the scenes I was visualizing as scenes that happened in the show, but honestly, I think it was pretty great. It's a book about a descent into madness, about someone who starts doubting herself, her sanity, and it's really fascinating. I loved reading this book. I absolutely want to read more Shirley Jackson books. I think the other novel of hers that I've had on my TBR for a while is We Have Always Lived in the Castle, so I thoroughly enjoyed reading this, and I loved seeing the little pieces and bits that led to The Haunting of Hill House on Netflix and what they took from this to create that show. It was really great. I recommend it if you're a fan of the show. Not that much is going to be spoiled because it's completely different. This only has 4 main characters, but yeah, I recommend it. I give it 4 stars. Next, I have another graphic novel, Laura Dean Keeps Breaking Up With Me by Mariko Tamaki and Rosemary Valero-O'Connell. This was one of my most anticipated releases of the entire year because I love Mariko Tamaki. I have read a bunch of her graphic novels and one of her just regular novels, and I love the way that she writes. I love the way that she writes girlhood. In particular, there's something about girlhood, but also queer girlhood that speaks to me. This is a graphic novel about a toxic relationship between girls, which is ground that I don't think is as covered as it should be in YA. Those queer relationships that aren't healthy and how you get into them, how you can be in them without seeing those issues, and it was a difficult read for me because it's a relationship that I've been in. And so there's always going to be that hardship there. I will say that I was expecting this to be a 5-star read. I was expecting to cry. I didn't quite get to that point. There are different books that Tamaki has written that I've enjoyed more. This One Summer, for example, is one of my favorite books of all time, one of my favorite graphic novels of all time. But I did love this. I loved the limited color palette. I was obsessed with the black and white and pink and how much style was there. It made me so invested in seeing what else Rosemary Valero-O'Connell has done and will do in the future, because this was so aesthetically pleasing to be reading, and it was so sad that I was reading a book so sad that looked this gorgeous, but it fit really well. This covers some other topics that are important in girlhood that aren't as covered in YA, such as abortion, a right to choose, friendships, how friendships are impacted by toxic relationships. It's really fascinating. I wound up giving this 4 stars. I really did enjoy it, and I really want my own copy. I got this one from the library, but I'm really glad I read it. This was, I think, a standout 2019 release, especially for, like, queer women, which is why I wanted to read it, so I recommend it. 4 stars. Second to last, I have The Stars and the Blackness Between Them by Junauda Petrus. This is a YA book that I think flew a little under the radar this year. It's a 2019 release, but was released back in September, so this says advanced reading copy. It's not. It's been out for a while. This follows 2 girls, 2 points of view, Audra and Mabel. Audra is from Trinidad, and her mother finds her kissing a girl, and her mother sends her to live with her father in Minneapolis. Basically is like, we've got to split the 2 of you up, and sends Audra away, which is really heartbreaking for Audra, not only because it's horrific to be outed to a parent that doesn't accept you, but also because she loves Trinidad and she loves her grandmother, and it's very difficult to be away from that place that she loves and that person that she loves so dearly. And then this is about Mabel, who lives in Minneapolis. She met Audra once when they were kids, but now they get to meet again, and Mabel is dealing with kind of a mystery illness that continues to get worse and worse, and this is about Audra and Mabel connecting, potentially falling in love, but ultimately just being there for one another during this incredibly difficult time for both of them, but particularly for Mabel in this instance. I wish that I knew better how to talk about this book, because there's so much here that I feel like it isn't my place to discuss, and the thing that I took away from this ultimately is how much this book celebrated Blackness. That's what this is about. It's about 2 Black women celebrating their own identity, about being proud of their different heritages, about coming together and learning, and about celebrating history, learning the injustices that they have been dealt, but also just being beautiful and Black and fabulous, and it's really, really brilliant for that, and it's part of why I feel so inadequate talking about it, because there's so much here that isn't my experience, but God, it was incredible to read this book. Mabel and Audra have this earnest and honest friendship and potential relationship. It's also about celebrating queerness, and I was actually talking to Jessie from Bow Ties and Books about this. They have an incredible YouTube channel, which I really, really recommend, but they posted a short review of this on Instagram that I think encapsulated this book a lot better than I have been able to, and we were talking about how it celebrated queer sex as worship, which is incredible, and it's something I haven't seen before in YA, about constantly emphasizing that sex between girls is worthy of worship. It is a religious experience for the women in this book, and that's so powerful and incredible. It's a hard read, and I think that's why for now I'm giving it 4 stars instead of the full 5 that I was initially feeling, because honestly this dealt with some really intense subjects, like regarding death, and I read this right after experiencing the most significant loss in my family that I've ever had to deal with. And so I think that I was holding myself at a distance from this book because I wasn't ready to go there yet. And it's gonna take me a while before I can go there. But this was brilliant. I really recommend this. I know a lot of people are participating in FF February. If you are, and you also want to be focusing on Black authors, please, please read this book. It is perfect for February. I really, really ask that people check this out, make it less of an underrated read, because it's worth it. It's worth the hype. It's just fantastic. So like I said, I gave this 4 stars. I would really love to listen to the audiobook at some point, because Jessie said that it was absolutely incredible and it added a ton to this experience of this, like I was talking about with the TwoSpirit Journey, this oral tradition of storytelling that was really valuable, particularly for Audra and the way that she narrated, but for Mabel as well, who is kind of experiencing all these different stories and telling them, retelling them, living them. So I really want to re-listen to the audiobook at some point, and I think that that might increase my reading as well. But those are my feelings on The Stars and the Blackness between them. I really recommend it. I feel like I have gushed enough. I hope that I got through to you all. And the final book as part of this wrap-up is Middlegame by Seanan and McGuire. This book was chosen for me by my patrons in December, and I am so glad that they did. This was a 2019 release that I didn't get to read earlier, and oh my god, it was incredible. But also very hard to summarize. So this is about twins, Roger and Dodger, and they are the embodiments of doctrine, which is related to alchemy. Okay, this is so complicated. But they're basically created to be embodiments of math and language, and so they are born and then separated. And then early on in childhood, they begin to hear one another in their thoughts. They can communicate in their thoughts. When one closes their eyes, they can see through the other's eyes. And it is about that, but it is also about a group of alchemists trying to take advantage of that, trying to use them for their own means, and you're killing a whole lot of people. So this is like adult fantasy. There are a lot of big concepts. A lot of the time the alchemy stuff comes across almost as sci-fi, the way that it's described. Like, it's so scientific the way that it works through all of these different fantastical elements that it felt weird to call it fantasy, even though alchemy is clearly magic and thus fantasy. But this was brilliant. I loved reading this. I, couldn't put it down. Every time I started to read it, I would read, 100 pages without blinking and then come back into myself and be like, oh wait, I've been reading for, an hour without noticing. Roger and Dodger are fantastic characters, and this did one of my favorite things. One of my favorite tropes in the universe is people being able to share thoughts. I think it's so fascinating, and I think it comes from my dislike of miscommunication. I always want people to just talk to each other. And so the concept of sharing a brain space and not having the ability to have that miscommunication, or if you do have miscommunication, there are different reasons for it, is so fascinating to me. I think it's also because I love the idea of being able to communicate with someone that deeply, to have someone else understand you to that degree. There's something about it, man. I loved it in fan fiction. I love it in books. Obviously for this, it's totally platonic because Roger and Dodger are twins. They are brother and sister. But, I love that. And I love the science, and I love how brutal and horrific this book was. I can't emphasize to you how many people die in this book. There is a lot of death. There's also time manipulation, child geniuses, possible godhood. I don't know how people have been describing this, because I'd never heard it, fully described, and once I was reading it, I was like, oh, it makes sense that I've never heard a full description of this book, because how in the hell do you boil this down to a summary? This is my best attempt. I hope that it helped. Also, I just looked at this cover. I read the whole book without this cover on, so I didn't think about it until I put the dust jacket back on, but now I understand this cover, and it's fucked up. Okay, it's fine. I loved reading this book. I love Seanan McGuire. I love her writing so much. I gave this book 4.5 stars. I think it would have been a full 5 stars if I'd gotten emotional, but there was so much happening, I, didn't have time to get emotional. This feels like reading an 8-book series contained in 530 pages. It's ridiculous, but I loved it. 4.5 stars. Thank you so much to my patrons who chose this book. It was amazing. And now we are going to move on to my TBR, the TBR section of this video. So I will say that I have a bunch of books I'm not talking about in this video. My patrons chose for me a themed TBR, which will lead to a themed vlog. So, secret TBR, Cece's first attempt at a secret TBR, kind of. That is something that my patrons voted on. I'm very excited about it, and I am already underway, already working on that TBR, and I'm really, really excited about it, really excited to share it. So, let me talk about the books that aren't on that list. I have 3 books to talk about. So first I want to share my patron chosen book for January. First, you may be thinking, Cece, didn't they choose like a bunch of books for your secret TBR? Kind of. On my Patreon, every month patrons choose a video for me to do and a book for me to read. In January, I'm kind of just reading a bunch that's all based on patrons. So the video that the patrons chose was the particular secret TBR topic. So that was one section. There was a totally different poll about a book that they chose for me to read, and I'm going to talk about that. I really wanted to thank my patrons. This is the 13th month going into having a Patreon, my 13th month going into a chosen book, a chosen video, and it has been an incredible year. So that's like really special to me. I wanted to shout out all my patrons, and I wanted to give a special shout out to my librarian patrons who are my patrons at the highest level. Those librarian patrons are Babette, Christine, Kim, Rebecca, and Rocks at @aspiring_rocks on Twitter and Instagram. Thank you all so much for what you do. The book that my patrons chose for me to read in the month of January is The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. I'm very excited to read this. I don't know that much about it, except for, like, its tragic Greek gaze. This is about Achilles and Patroclus, and, it was really popular a few years ago on BookTube, and everyone still talks about this book a lot as making them cry, so I'm ready to cry. It's time. This is what my patrons chose, that's all I know about it. I am ready to be destroyed. The next book that I want to talk about for my TBR is part of one of my 2020 goals, which is to read at least one short story collection every single month. So the short story collection that I am focusing on in January is Sabrina and Karina by Fajardo-Anstine. This is a powerful meditation on friendship, mothers, and daughters, and the deep-rooted truths of our homelands. So that is what this is. I heard a bunch of people talk about this in late 2019. This was on a ton of lists. This won a bunch of awards. Recently, I was out and about at a bookstore and I saw it and I grabbed it and now I'm reading it. I think it's going to be a beautiful story collection and I'm really, really eager to get into these. And I'm really excited because this is my first short story collection of the year and that makes me very happy. And the third and final book on this TBR, I haven't chosen yet. So, I have my TBR jar. I talked about this also in my 2020 goals video. Basically, this is every book that I owned prior to 2019 ending, and every month I am going to grab a book out of this jar, and I have to either read it or get rid of it by the end of the month. So, the only exception that I'm making is if it's Priory of the Orange Tree, I'm not reading it. I have to set aside a specific month for Priory of the Orange Tree, and I shouldn't have put it in the jar, but it's too late now. So, here we go. The first book from my TBR jar is... Ooh. Can you see? Once Upon a River. Okay. So... Once Upon a River by Diane Setterfield. This is adult fantasy. So, it's gonna be kind of a hefty one to get through, but that's okay. I made a goal. This is about a young girl who is rescued from a wintry river, and a bunch of different people claim her. Like, she almost dies, she comes back to life, and she is crossed over through a bunch of stories, and yeah. I love Diane Setterfield. I have read one book of hers that's one of my favorite books of all time. I've read one book of hers that I couldn't stand. So Once Upon a River is going to decide whether I love Diane Setterfield and one book was an outlier, or I hate Diane Setterfield and one book was an outlier. It's time. Gotta read it before the end of the month, or get rid of it. That's the first TBR Jar Pick. Okay, that is it. Those are all of the books that I wanted to talk about as part of my December wrap-up, my January TBR. If you have read any of these books, please let me know your thoughts about them down in the comments below. I would love to hear your reviews, your recommendations, your thoughts about the end of 2019, your thoughts about my first TBR of the year. I have been horrifically ill, so I am doing my best to come back around, get to filming as many videos as possible because I have so much that I want to make. I have so many videos planned. I'm really excited to share them all with you. Other than that, I hope you have an incredible day. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you in another one very soon. Bye!